Olga Kuchmiienko, and I am head of the International Law Committee of Ukrainian Bar Association. And we are more than happy to greet you all at our event, which I will present a bit later. And I just want to share that there will be a recording of this event. So if you have not been registered, please do so and you will receive a link. Today we will talk about international law for in-house lawyers. We will talk about the topic of international law, obviously, that might be interesting for lawyers and for in-house lawyers and for partners of the law firm. And we will talk about EU accession of Ukraine. What does it bring to Ukraine next? And luckily today, we have our speakers, Nicoleta Tuominen and Oleksii Dorohan. I will let them present themselves. And I am just happy to have these reputable speakers and our event. And we have my co-moderator and dear friend and dear colleague at the International Law Committee of Ukrainian Bar Association, Bukvych, who is deputy head of the International Law Committee, and she will co-moderate this event today. When we thought about the topic of this event and why would we like to have actually this event, we realized that for the past more than 20 years, Ukraine is on the path of EU, is on the EU path, and I think that Ukraine is one of the most motivated countries to join the EU that we have seen in the history. And for those who might not know, basically the annexation of Crimea and the war in Ukraine started from the most idea of joining the EU. And if previously we thought, okay, there is maybe 1 or 2 steps per decade on this path, the last summer has brought a lot. On 21st of June, their opening of negotiations with the EU has happened, and after that, during August, there were several sessions on check of Ukrainian legislation in certain fields. There were, I think, 12 or 13 sessions scheduled, and then in September, just recently, there were this second two-party session EU-Ukraine that should have bring these checks of legislation to a new level. That is why today we want to talk about main do's and don'ts on this path and what does this stage means. And also we want to hear from Oleksii Dorohan about Ukrainian perspective, where we now and where we're heading with challenges we have, etc. But let's take step by step. I will leave the floor to Nicoleta. Let's start. Nicoleta, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Olga. It's both a pleasure and an honor to be with you this afternoon and to speak to you on this particular topic. My name is Nicoleta Tuominen. I am a partner with Dentons Europe, LLP. We are based in Brussels, so at the center, at the heart of where this accession process started and is taking place, coordinated from. So my experience in the field comes from years of working in EU law and following closely the accession process of previous candidates, including my own country, Romania. Talking to what the topic that Olga suggested on the international aspects of the accession process for Ukraine, I would first note that there are currently 9 candidate countries, however, which all had started basically the pre-accession discussions with the European Union. However, only 2 have been admitted into the formal negotiation process. And one of those countries is Ukraine. That step happened very, very fast because other candidate countries have been in the pre-accession discussions for many years, many more years than Ukraine. What does this change in status change for Ukraine? Well, together with the EU, there will be a division of Ukraine's legislation or fields of operation of a state into 35 chapters. The Commission is the EU institution leading the accession process, and together with Ukraine and Ukrainian experts for each of these chapters, there will be a screening of the legislation, of the practices applicable to that particular chapter in Ukraine. And at the end, there will be a report with recommendation for changes. These reports, and then of course, the reports need to be implemented, and this is a follow-on process. Member states receive regularly, I think on a yearly basis, these progress reports, and they monitor also closely the evolution. To the question of whether all chapters have a similar weight, I would say yes and no. They are ranked basically into 5 groups, and the first group is perhaps evidently the main important one, the main one, which includes fundamentals. That's the name of the group. It's not surprising that within this group you have the chapters of judiciary, fundamental rights, justice, freedom, security, public procurement, statistic, financial control, all these economic criteria and functioning of the public administration. Does that chapter weigh more? Well, it is called fundamentals. That is at the basis of the functioning of the European Union, and obviously it is one of the most significant in terms of ensuring a compatibility with the candidate country. However, the other chapters, reflecting mainly the economics, should not be neglected. Equally, when I said that the progress is monitored closely by member states, Ukraine needs to take into account in this process that different member states have different interests in one or several of these chapters. So if for one member state, one chapter, the energy 15 is the main chapter, basically in terms of economics, for another it could be agriculture, transport, or any other of the economic sector. It is an opportunity. It is definitely an opportunity because together with this change in status comes also a package of support to the candidate. Support in terms of know-how, but also economic, financial support, which should not be neglected, which should help the country reach the goals that it wants to achieve, basically, together with the European Union. It was often said that with the other candidate countries, the pre-accession process, if you will, is taken way too long. It's demotivating because at some point, after 3-4 years of pre-accession discussions, one legitimately asks itself, is this going to lead anywhere? But even so, having an external party look into chapters into the functioning of your country to point out shortcomings, it's surely not a disadvantage for that state, right? If together or on the path of this pre-accession, aspects that are important for any state are solved or are addressed, that can be only an improvement or an advantage that you gain by being engaged in this process, right? Also being engaged in this process, even as simple candidate country, already communicates to the international community a certain level of alignment, right, with European Union. If not already de facto, so in terms of the laws or how they're applied, but in terms of mentality and in terms of aspirations, which should also not be neglected. I think it's a signal, it's a very positive signal that the process for moving from candidate country to engage in the formal negotiations was shorter than for the others is a very positive signal. And it also shows the willingness to progress fast, right? But it also depends on the cooperation on the other side, because, as I said, there are 35 chapters, each of them with their set of legislation or institutions that work within that chapters, and all will be screened, right? And these results will need to be addressed and discussed between the parties. One legitimate question would be, is it a mathematical assessment? Is it really, you have this criteria and the conditions to consider each chapter closed are 1 to 100, and you can easily in a table mark them yes, no, and then in the end you have an average of completion of the conditions. I believe it's more complex than that. It is always based on an assessment. The assessment is not in terms of charts. Usually it's really a description provided. And that description can be read in one way or another, depending on the member state, on their current or political regime at that point, whether that regime is in favor of enlargement or whether they consider that 27 is the optimal size and there should be no further enlargement. So it's one cannot say that it's a mathematical assessment. At the end, several factors need to come together for a country to be successful. In my opinion, and this is my personal opinion, does not represent that of my law firm, is that it is a political assessment of the member states, of their willingness to accept a new member in, because I dare to express the view that not all EU member states have been entirely ready to become equal members of the European Union when they joined. And for those member states or future member states, there are still mechanisms within the European Union to contain potential persisting shortcomings within the functioning of the institutions or the administration of that state. Notably, Romania and Bulgaria had until recently no access or basically to the Schengen area. Now that has changed with one minor exception. And that had to do with the country's ability to ensure an effective protection of their borders. Romania was, and I believe still is, under a current monitoring process of the corruption, progress in the sphere of combating corruption. So the process of improvement continues, right? It doesn't stop at the moment of accession, because, as I said, I dare to say very few of the new member states fulfilled entirely all the criteria. And then there's more support, and eventually, you know, over the years we get there. What makes it very special in Ukraine's case, really very special, and makes it much more commendable, is the fact that, and I'm sure Oleksii will address this issue, that Ukraine is trying to work on this cumbersome process in the current situation, right? Because none of the other member states have been in that situation, and still they found it difficult, still they found it frustrating, practices that seemed normal and established and not criticable from their perspective locally, were then questioned. And of course, it's frustrating, but their situation was different. So I'm happy to take any questions. That was my short introduction on some technicalities of the process and mixed with some manners in which I see the assessment of the finality.
Thank you, Nicoleta. Let's say we give the floor to Oleksii first, and then we might take questions, so we discuss them all together in our panel discussion. And if there are any questions in the chat, from our audience, please post them in the chat. Oleksii, thank you, Nicoleta. Thanks once again. Thank you for your view and for your expertise. And Oleksii, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I was told that I need to address two issues. One is
maybe it's on my side, but I cannot hear you well.
The sound is bad.
May you please present yourself, because Oleksii has a very interesting position. Better, but not really.
Okay, let's try like this. Is it fine now? Okay.
Oh, it's much better.
It's nodding. Yeah, so I was told by the organizer that there are two issues it would be great if I could discuss. One is, how does the process look like for outsiders, for people that are not working in the team of Vice Prime Minister for Euro integration, that know everything that needs to be known about the process of negotiations, but by people in private and in public sector, and how they can play a role in the negotiations. As Nicoleta hinted, what is important here is that this is not an exam, and therefore it is not only judged on the technical compliance. So there is a lot of negotiation dynamics there, and there is a lot of politics involved. So bear that in mind when you're looking at the negotiation process, because it's going to take a while. It's going to have its ups and downs. It's going to have it's not like it's not two parties in silos that are negotiating, the Ukrainian government and the European Commission. There is dozens, if not hundreds, of stakeholders that one way or another would be playing a role in the negotiations, maybe thousands, I don't know. And you can play a role in the negotiations too. Everyone can play a role. So what are we looking at? So we're looking at, you can open the enlargement report and you can see the assessment of the European Commission about how close Ukraine is to complying with the Stockholm criteria. So how close are we to be getting to the European Union technically, not politically, technically. And obviously any such assessment tells you what has been done and what has not been done. And it is a kind of also a bit of a judgment, but don't take this too literally. It's not a judgment about compliance level area by area. And it also spells out what needs to be done in the future. So you can see what Ukrainian government is probably going to be doing in the next years. I don't want to be naming years. I've heard different deadlines for accession. People float 2030, people float 2040. Nobody knows, but what's going to happen in those years? Ukraine will be doing broadly things that have been included in the enlargement report. What is it? What is included in the enlargement report? We need to implement all acquis, all EU law, and we need to meet the Stockholm criteria, which is a very nice way of saying we need to be European, because this is not a legal test. The Stockholm criteria is not going to be litigated in European courts. It's a political test of whether a country seems to be a European country. You can look it up. You can look in the enlargement report at fundamentals. You can look at in the enlargement report on other issues around the Stockholm criteria. In different countries, different issues come up, and how these issues come up is not only coming from Ukrainian government and the European Commission. This is also coming from member states, and this is also coming from stakeholders in Ukraine and stakeholders in the EU and in member states. And therefore, any stakeholder, like a business association, an industry group, an NGO, can have its own set of issues that it cares about, and that it wants to be addressed in this way or in another way. And this is what's on the balance, right? This is what we are negotiating. We're negotiating what will ultimately impact interests of stakeholders that will definitely be affected as part of the accession process. These are farmers in country A, farmers in country B, industrialists in country A, industrialists in country B. And therefore, if you work in private or in public sector as a lawyer, it is probably going to be impacting your job as well. So if you work in a certain area, take a look at the enlargement report in the relevant chapter. You can Control F, you can find your area that you're working in. You can look at, you can forecast what's going to be happening in your area in terms of accession. You can club together with other organizations working in the same area. You can figure out what's your interest. You can write analytical papers. You can do a key analysis. You can do concordance tables. You can send those materials, if you work in Ukraine, to Ukrainian government. If you work in other countries, to your member state government or to commission, equipping them with materials to protect your interest. And this is how lobbyism and advocacy works in Brussels, in member states, and how it ultimately will work in Ukraine. And then, of course, there's going to be implementation work, and you can follow it. You can litigate sometimes based on those rules, or if those rules are not set right. But I think this is one of the best ways you can engage in the accession process. So first, monitor what is likely to happen, then monitor what is happening, and then make your voice heard in case you want things to develop in a particular manner. How to make your voice heard, depending on whether you're in private or in public sector, whether you're in an NGO or not, you can be part of the negotiation group. That's a decision that's taken by the Ukrainian government, who they include in the working group on the relevant chapter. But you can also be outside, just providing materials, doing outreach, communication. And believe me, there is so much work to be done in the accession process. There needs to be thousands of lawyers, experts, analysts working inside and outside the Ukrainian government if we want for our negotiations to be successful. Because right now we are at a very early stage in the negotiation process, and the goalposts have moved. So right at the point where everyone in the Euro bubble of Ukraine got used to the association agreement, which worked like this, broadly for lawyers and experts. You have annexes. Annexes have a key, lists of EU law that needs to be implemented. Lawyers and experts read it up, write Ukrainian implementing regulations. This gets passed. We write Facebook posts that we're closer to be in the EU. Job done. One sector is better, another is worse, but the goalposts are very clear and very specific. Surprise, goalpost has moved. It's completely different. Nobody cares about the list in the annex to the accession agreement. We need to do full compliance with the key. Sometimes it can lead to completely bizarre choices. For instance, some EU law is direct effect. So if we wrote a law that implemented a piece of a key that has direct effect, do you know what we need to do when we are part of the EU? We need to cancel it. So we spent years writing a law that nobody cares about anymore, because we needed it to get into the EU, but now we need to cancel it because now it's direct effect. We don't need a Ukrainian law. The goalpost has moved, and if you want to understand what is the new goalpost, read the enlargement report. And of course, there is the Ukrainian governmental self-screening results, so self-screening lists that list out all the new acquis that we need to implement. These are the main ways this you can play your part, you can engage in the accession process. And the second issue that I've been asked to talk about is to speak to foreign investors about why they should care about Ukrainian accession process and Ukrainian Euro integration. And there is a very simple answer. It seems, from what we can hear in the speeches of European politicians, from what we can read in the documents produced by the European institutions, Ukraine is expected to become part of the EU. In terms of possible economic signals, this is one of the strongest signals you can get about how an economy will develop in the future. So what you should be motivated by is by fear of missing out, because investors that would be coming before we are part of the EU and investing before that would be ahead of investors that come after. So there is a bit of a FOMO game. So you need not you probably don't want to be late to the party, and the political integration of Ukraine into the European Union is a very powerful signal that all the policies of nearshoring, of strategic autonomy, of critical raw materials alliance, stuff like that, will come to Ukraine one day or another. And if you're looking at where to nearshore, where to build your supply chains, if you want to be inside the border of the EU in an economy that has not yet caught up with other European countries in terms of cost of doing business, then Ukraine is probably a good choice. Of course, there is a large-scale war going on right now. Of course, a lot of investors right now are scouting, but doing feasibility or pre-feasibility, but not actually carrying out large-scale investments. But my advice to investors would be to monitor what is going on and be very quick when you feel that the situation is changing. I know there is some questions in the chat. I don't know. I see Igor. Right? This is the question or are we taking questions after everyone spoke?
Yes, but you are the last speaker and we start the discussion, so you can answer.
Yeah, I think Oleksii, you can answer now because you also can your speech also relates to investors, so I think it will be good to answer.
Well, Igor is asking, does it make sense for Ukraine to sell the whole industries to investors only for the purposes of bringing them into the EU negotiations? So, or only to multinationals from the EU, so that again, the decision points are shifting to EU corporate under possible influence of local business interests. Igor, very glad to hear from you. We go way back. Now, in terms of, I don't see this as a zero sum, like selling whole industries to EU investors. I'm not sure we're at a point where this is likely to happen right now. So imagine you are a European publicly listed company. Buying out Ukrainian companies is not, lawyers will tell you that buying out a Ukrainian subsidiary is gonna force you to write a lot of disclaimers and risks in your prospectus and in your reporting. So what we are seeing is what I think is more likely is supply chain deals, right? So and what we would be economically negotiating is how much processing can we onshore to Ukraine so that we do not export on the raw materials, so that the EU gets what it needs. I mean the EU companies get what they need, and we get what we need, which is like a more deep processing of what is grown and dug out from the ground, stuff like that. And I'm not seeing right now commercial interests dominating the accession negotiations. It's very early right now, so I don't think this is a zero-sum game at this point where we either sell everything and get into the EU or not. I've never heard such dynamics from any stakeholder in the EU right now. So there is a lot of genuine support to Ukraine accession. There is understanding that, of course, business interests will play some role in the negotiations, but it's very easy, very early to say right now. We're just so there is a lot of chapters. We haven't opened 90% of the chapters, not even closed. We haven't opened them, so nobody will tell you right now how it's going to play out. I see Nicoleta is nodding. Maybe she wants to add something because I've been speaking for a while.
Thank you, Oleksii. I fully agree with you. Perhaps your acquaintance is hinting at the situation that happened in some newer member states where there was an impression that because, or as a condition of the accession, parts of the national industry, so companies that belong to the state, had to be sold, and then in most cases, practically they couldn't be rescued, and the respective plant or factories had been closed. I'm not sure if that is the direction that the question went into, but I guess that could be a legitimate concern. However, the reality in those countries was that many of the state-owned companies were loss-making for many years, and there is no obligation, absolute obligation imposed to sell particular industries or factories if there is potential for them to be rescued, but if there's not, if the state has no means to do that, then indeed a private investor should be given a chance, and then, let the company basically operate under market conditions. I think that would be a change, an economic change for companies and mid and middle-sized companies, the opening of the market to the EU, which has a lot of advantages in terms of possibilities to export, like limitless, but it would also mean additional competition, which wasn't there until now. And it's indeed, as Oleksii said, it's everyone's choice on how and if they want to take part, basically, in the process, because there is something to benefit from for everybody.
Thank you very much.
And I see there is another question, right?
Yeah.
Could you give an advice for a middle market company which is engaged in agri-processing, where to look in this context, how to engage and make impact on them, the Ukrainian company? Well, my advice would be club together, join an agri association, ask management of the agri association, is there a team being assembled, funded by members, to look at those issues? So that would be my advice. And of course, push for it, right? Create a team, hire some lawyers, start preparing.
Nicoleta, do you have something to add?
No, I fully agree. I mean, you have to make your voice heard, and as Oleksii rightly pointed out, there will be many voices that would want to be heard in this process. So if you create a group that is backed up by many members, of course, that carries more weight and has a louder voice, and its voice has more weight in the process than as one single company trying to be heard.
And
Okay.
Anna, before you move to your next question, may I ask actually one question here about this topic? Which role, we understood that professional organizations will have bigger role in this respect. We understood that some lobby companies can have bigger role in that sense. And my question is, which role can have law firms in this sense? I mean, global law firms and maybe local law firms as well, like some niche law firms that work with certain areas. And I think Anna also wanted to ask about better regulation delivery office role and aspects, but I will leave it to Anna.
I can
Yeah,
answer
definitely.
your first question, maybe,
First, yeah.
about the law firms, indeed. As you know, law firms would represent someone in this process, right? They wouldn't go in out of their own initiative with a position, right? This is not their place to do that. So there would be already a position that they are taking for a client, and it could be anybody, any one of these stakeholders. It could be one company, it could be an association, it could be even a governmental agency or parts of the government that need legal support in that sense. So that's the role that international law firms can play, and what basically in such situations, what lawyers do perhaps better than lobbying companies is to formulate the issue in such a way that the part of the government in charge of legislating in that field understands what is wanted. Because simply formulating a request in commercial terms may mean very little for someone working on a piece of legislation and not understanding within that legislation what the emphasis should be or what emphasis is wanted. So basically lawyers translate commercial needs on behalf of their clients and then present those to the government, or assist the government with interpreting several pieces of EU law, or assessing whether one proposal would cover, the needs, to what extent. So that's the role that law firms can fulfill in the process.
Thank you very much. I also have one question related to, let's say, the main challenges based on the previous experience of other countries. As we know, like the process of accession of EU is quite, let's say, very specific for each of the country. Nevertheless, we have a legal scheme which we are following. Each country has his own priorities, process, the timeline, etc. So my question relates to the following. So if we take the experience of other countries, what are the main challenges before, and let's say what is the main clusters and chapters which are more difficult to negotiate? And in this respect, the second one is that I know that the chapter can be closed, or negotiation of the chapter can be closed even there is no 100% of the implementation of the requirements. And then to do the time for the country after the accession, then when they have time to implement some of the requirements. So what is the most challenging in this respect? And if there are any situation where the country is stuck on some of this implementation, and what can be done to avoid such a situation, when nevertheless we receive the green light with the postponement, we then have some problems and challenging assignment to implement all the requirements. Maybe to Oleksii as well, related to Ukrainian experience, and to Nicoleta, maybe based on the experience of other countries.
Oleksii, would you like to start?
Well, I can answer only about fundamentals because I feel like there are so many chapters and so many niches that it's impossible to find one person to understand enough the entire process to be able to tell you what are the highlights. Now, in terms of fundamentals, because it was interesting to me because I feel like this is the least understood part of the accession process, because in other areas you have a key, and the Stockholm are more difficult. So when I was looking at this, there were issues of privatization. So as Nicoleta said, sometimes you would have a country that its economy is state dominated, it's inefficient, it's difficult to figure out the subsidies, and and the EU represented other member states would push hard on asking the incoming country to privatize its companies, its industries. So we did a lot of privatization, but we did it before, not through European lens. We did it before in terms of reducing corruption, improving efficiencies, and privatization was never mentioned in the European bubble. But now suddenly privatization is a European issue, right? Because one of the criterion is I don't remember it word for word, but like well-functioning market economy. So we would be tested against that test, right? Whether we are well-functioning market economy. Now, I would not remember other contentious issues. I have that in my notes. Maybe I'll remember them after Nicoleta speaks.
Thank you. You brought it to the point. On the point, basically, there are so many chapters, and the chapters include so many components that from an outside, actually, even if you're part of the government assisting very closely the process, you might not have the full overview of all the sections from all the chapters, right? They're very technical, very specialized, and it's not only you who's there, there's the commission, there are the member states, and or the rest. So it's difficult to say for other member states, which was, I can confirm indeed for Romania and Bulgaria, it was part of the fundamentals, of course, which are still being dealt with to some extent. And I also believe those stand out, or I have, and you, Oleksii, we could easily mention them because those are the most prominent ones. So, as I said, the process is also one that is driven by political interest, and there is always, or there could be always, some member states trying to hold the process, right? And the main reasons they would publicly point at for refusing, because the others are economic. The others would be, we don't want that country in because if they're in, then this part of our national economy is weakened, which is not, an argument that would gather much support. But if they point at border security, if they point at the independence of justice, that is, something very serious with serious implications, and bears the resemblance of justifying their position. So all the chapters are important in different contexts and for different member states. Those that are mainly picked on by opposers in the process are parts of the fundamentals.
I found my notes. So Poland, justice reform, anti-corruption. Romania, anti-corruption, justice. Croatia, fighting organized crime and state administration reform. Bulgaria, state administration reform and rule of law. I'm sure you can find that some of these issues may be relevant to Ukraine, and we would be having similar discussions. And if you want to learn how they laid out, you can look up those examples.
Thank you. Maybe also the question related to this one concerning the implementation in Ukraine. Some of the legal acts, I know, like I'm watching the figure of legal acts to be implemented in the view of the EU accession, and I can see like the permanent reduction of the quantity of the legal acts to be implemented. Now it's around 500, if I'm not mistaken. Even in summer, it was around 2,000 or 3,000, something around. What is the progress on this respect? If we are on the track, if there are any problematic legal acts, and what the perspective of their implementation? It may be to Oleksii, the question.
I think one word: constitution. Yes, it's a lot, but we might need to amend the constitution, which is, as you know, impossible right now. But yeah, there is a lot of other legal acts, but I'm not sure everyone understands also the constitution.
A part of the constitution, if there are any progress in this respect, if we're not talking about the main law, if we're talking about other legislative acts.
Well, of course, there is a lot of progress, and it's part of regular monitoring by European Commission, by civil society. There are reports, there are shadow reports, but even the numbers that you spell out seem to hint that with the time that we had since the negotiations started, it is impossible to do this in 1 year. So every area is different. There are consultations, informal, on how we can do something to track progress area by area, similarly to how it was done in the association process. So there was a website, Pulse of the Association Agreement, that was showing you everyone the progress as seen by Ukrainian government in terms of how far we have progressed in this or that area. But apart from the enlargement report, right now there is probably nothing that could tell you how far we are. There has been somebody did so there is you need to also to understand that European bureaucracy works in a specific jargon. So there's a European bureaucratic language, and I would come to Nicoleta for lessons if she opens them, because I need to read up on European bureaucratic language. So there are words that for you and me would not mean anything, but there is like 5 levels of readiness as the Commission assesses progress of a country in terms of meeting the membership criteria and implementing the key in different chapters. And for every chapter in that enlargement report, there is one of the specific bureaucratic wordings about how far Ukraine has come. And there's been one organization, I don't remember the name, Ukrainian NGO, that deciphered that bureaucratic language and made an infographic where you can look at every chapter and you can see, I think, a number of how far we are. And this way it's easier to visualize our progress. But if or when you find it, and I'll look it up and send it to the comments, if I find it in the next 10 minutes, you'll see we're not there yet.
Okay, maybe our participants may have some comments or any questions. Maybe then I will continue the topic regarding the investors. And Would AI help Ukraine to join EU? Is the question.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's
Definitely, yes.
difficult to say how exactly, but definitely, yes. It has definitely helped me to prepare, well, to research some of the issues around accession. So
The question is
ChatGPT helps me.
if we
Well,
can
but like,
trust it on how 100% of all
no,
the
of course
stuff.
not.
Nicoleta, do you have any comments on this one regarding the help of AI?
I mean, we all know, and I think Oleksii was also making a joke. In order for such an AI to be effective, it would already need to be basically fed all the Ukrainian legislation, and it would need to be trained to recognize what it needs to recognize and point out deficiencies. So it would need to include both the Ukrainian entire system of legislation and entire EU acquis. And then it would need to be trained to what to do with them, because it doesn't know automatically what kind of inconsistencies to spot, right? So it could be done, but it requires work. A lot of work, in my opinion.
And maybe coming back to this question of investments and investors, again, based on the experience of other countries, can we tell that once the country enters to the negotiation process, it will have like more attention from investors, and we can say that the interest will rise, and if it is possible to analyze the proportion of this before accession, before the negotiation, during negotiation, and after, we can see the huge rise of the interest, or it's like the quite let's say middle set process, and it can, these factors of each stage doesn't relate to each other and the interest of the investors.
I'm happy to start on this one. I believe, of course, the stage of the negotiations is relevant. I mean, the closer you are to the beginning, investors want guarantees, right? Investors want legal guarantees. They want the guarantee that they won't be, that their property won't be nationalized. They want the guarantee that there won't be random or abusive tax investigations. They want guarantees that if they have a contentious matter, they can rely on impartial judges to solve it. So those are, they want to have a stable tax system that they can rely on, not that there, you know, every month there's a new tax that comes on top of what's existing. So they want stability, right? They want guarantees that their investment is safe, and whatever situation they have and they need to use one of the state resources, that they can do so safely and to the same standards as somewhere else. Now, that being said, it is a fact that shortly after accession, and possibly closer to the ending of the, or in, you know, well in the process of accession, investors do pay more attention, because there will be already investment made in the infrastructure, in electricity supply. So all those basic needs that make, you know, a physical operation function in a place. And what's also very attractive is the still difference in wages and salaries that they will need to pay. So it is a fact, new members have attracted a lot of investment from the older member states. That has been a very positive development. It is true, some may leave, you know, if another member state joins, or the tax conditions or any other conditions are much better in a different member state, but not necessarily. So if they come in that period because they are attracted by the cheaper labor force and the boom in investment in infrastructure and then other resources that they need, it's not necessary that they will leave if there's a cheaper production place. So I think that's also probably Oleksii can confirm. It's not something very difficult to quantify, right? You can see the level of foreign direct investment now. You can track it throughout the accession process, and in the following 5 years post accession. And what is a certainty, and I have no doubt about it, that level, irrespective of the current situation, right? We're talking about a normal situation, not the current situation. You will see for every member state an increase compared to how it was before accession.
Oleksii, do you have something to add?
Probably not.
Yeah, I just saw the link that you just sent to us. I also read this article, and as I understand, like for some matters or for some questions of the process, we are quite ahead, and for some of them, we are really failed some of the implementation. But to my mind, it is only like a matter of time, because for some the requirements later or earlier we need to be compliant with, and we just sometimes we postpone of implementing some of the very painful requirements for later stage for some reason. But I understand we made a great process for some of the clusters, which is good. And yeah, do you have any comments to this one, Oleksii?
Well, I'm with you. I like to see a half glass that is half full. But there are 3 areas that have 5 out of 5, and the rest of the table is broadly yellow, and there is as much green as there is red. So we're definitely, even if we look super optimistically at this table, we are less than at 50% there yet. But I'm with you, there has been a lot of stuff that has been done. So if you look back, Ukraine did a lot, but we should do at least as much as we've done before.
But I know that I'm always telling that, to be honest, we started the full implementation process. I think that maybe even not in 2014, even later. And indeed, like there are only 2 years of intensive work. Before that time, I heard that like we are declaring a lot and doing nothing. Because I agree with Nicoleta in this respect, that sometimes a lot of political factors can impact on the process, like inside the country as well as the inside EU. And I heard also from a lot of people that it is quite a political process. If we are even negotiating, let's say, which requirements, implementation of which requirements we can postpone. Sometimes it's the political negotiation also. Yeah, so let's hope that we will continue to be in such intensive work for the upcoming years, because to my mind, we just started, to be honest. Yeah, Olga, so if you have something to add to
Yes,
this.
I'm patiently waiting with my question. My question was, if I summarize what we just discussed, it looks like we have certain like precise requirements, and they're super extensive. There are numerous of them, and it's even hard to summarize, like to list them all for one person. On the other hand, we have some general areas, and if we in general see this area as improved, then nobody cares about that listed requirements, I would say certain EU law to implement or certain legislation change to make. And with this, I come with a question. So since we opened negotiations and we start work on all that requirements, what is the next step in EU path? And with this being said, is there a chance to go to this next step before closing some requirements? And I am talking not about that small minor ones, but about areas that, let's say, cannot be that green before we come to that next step. I think this question is more to Nicoleta, but I want, of course, to answer both speakers to elaborate a bit on that.
So I think we need to clarify some concepts of EU bureaucratic language. So you can close a chapter, right, even if it's not entirely fulfilled, right? It depends, as I said, there are regular reports presented to member states, and if member states deem the existing progress sufficient, right? If they collectively deem it sufficient, then that chapter can be closed, and then of course it needs to be reopened and addressed while being in accession, accessed, being part of the EU. It's difficult to predict how willing they are, and let's not forget, it is a long process, and in this long process, governments change. So if you start off with a positive attitude from one member state because a certain party is in the government, if at the next election you find yourself with a very EU hostile party, that makes, of course, and that changes the entire dynamic of the negotiations. If you have one member state who's constantly going to oppose any closing or any, and that's a variable that you can't influence, right? So to answer your question, you can close a chapter even if it's not fully completed, depending on the willingness of the member states.
Yeah, I also wanted to add, instinctively, it seems a good idea to ask to open everything. Let's open all the chapters, let's negotiate, and then close them one by one. So some people from the EU informally tell me, Oleksii, you don't want to open the chapter right now. Trust me, you're gonna have problems there. So there is also a bit of expectations management. So you need to be somewhere to open a chapter. You need to be somewhere closer, obviously much closer to full implementation, to close the chapter. But probably there is a significant effort involved in opening a chapter and then in negotiating a chapter. So it's probably going to go in batches, right? You would be spending and prioritizing resources to make sure you have traction. Of course, we as Ukraine want to do everything, but I think that we are in for some expectations management, and we are going to spend significant time learning how to negotiate those chapters, and it's unlikely we're gonna hit it home first time, first session, first negotiation, open and close it, shut it down. Probably not going to happen. So we need to understand that this is a difficult fight, and we're probably not going to be fighting all the fights at the same time.
Mm-hmm. I would like to add maybe to that. It's also a strategic decision, right, Oleksii? I mean, you analyze, your ability to process chapters now, And if you find once certain capacity is freed, you can address others, right? To allocate capacity, but also strategic in the sense that you monitor probably closely the political situation in the member states, and that could also determine whether you open a chapter now or whether you open it in 6 months or 3 months when a certain change has happened, and you will have more support even from that member states or a bunch of member states. So I think it is a complex set of decisions that go into opening that chapter or the other or some.
Yeah, thank you. It seems like it's very like interesting game, I would say, to decide which card you open right now. And yeah, that's good to discuss it now. And one more question. And I see our questions in the chat, and I will ask them right away after this question. I know that some states, when they were joining the EU, they refused to, I would not say work on some chapters, but they refused to make certain changes in legislation because that was historically like important for them. I am, for those that don't know, I live in Sweden and I work in Sweden, and I think the first thing I learned about Sweden when I moved here some years ago was that Swedes like snus. For those who don't know, this is something instead of smoking, some pads like chewing gum, but you just put this nicotine in your mouth, and so you don't impact anyone but yourself. And that is banned in entire EU, but not in Sweden, because as far as I know from my colleagues, they said that Sweden has had a huge fight on that, just no, leave snus fast, because it's historically important. So I have a question to Oleksii. Can Ukraine claim certain areas as that historically important to be left? And can it be something serious, like, let's say, agricultural land only for Ukrainians? Now I'm provoking you a bit, but you got the question probably.
Well, I can get in trouble, so can Nicoleta take this?
Good.
Okay. I would just add, I'm very familiar with the snus. It's more graphically, there are patches of tobacco that you stick between your gum and your mouth, and you look very funny for a while. And the person that it impacts your immediate circle. So like partners and friends who have to speak to you during this period. Absolutely. And this is a funny example of a desired opt-out, right? Yes, preventing the effects of nicotine or addiction created by nicotine was very important and high on the agenda. But then again, compared with how much harm those patches do, and if they're indeed only used in one country and they're not allowed to be exported, that was probably not a very, very difficult concession to obtain. But there are some which will be very difficult to obtain, right? And some member states have used del leverage, because for many decisions, as you know, in the EU, it requires unanimity. So some have used this, the fact that the EU needs their vote for a certain decision as a leverage to obtain concessions while being a member state. It could very well be that in the process of accession, Ukraine identifies a certain resource, be it young labor force, qualified young labor force that is needed everywhere in the EU, or a certain other agriculture or whatever resource that Ukraine has in abundance and that is very attractive and needed in the EU. And it could, being aware of that asset would allow Ukraine to also put conditions, right? Of course, metaphorically, Ukraine is asking to join a club, right? And when you ask to join a club, in principle, you wouldn't set conditions if it's you wanting to join the club. However, why not? Why would you not use any leverage that you have to protect something that is worth protecting? And you need to also really consider very well whether something that seems ad hoc, something that has been really intrinsic to the functioning of Ukrainians, or the mentality, the spirit of Ukrainians, but maybe analyzed soberly, doesn't really match with today's standards, right? Politically correctness or whatever principle that is very important and it's core to the EU, right? So you need to basically make a very clever determination what is worth protecting, really. And if protecting that, if you can justify it without the union having to give up, I don't know, fundamental requirements that it would have towards a member state or a future member state. And then you see, of course, once you are in the EU, as I said, I mean, it would be silly not to use then existing leverages to push, your interests forward. But at this stage, yeah, it has to be cleverly done. If there's a possibility, by all means, it should be used, but it should be cleverly used.
Thank you very much. That was a very extensive reply, and thank you that you give you not the answer, because unfortunately it's not Nicoleta that taken the decision of getting Ukraine to the EU, but you give us like clear criteria of how we shall like put our thinking in. Then, since we realized criteria from Nicoleta and realized that you need to go and work for Oleksii Dorohan if you want to work with some interesting issues of opting out, etc. I will go to questions in our chat. Thank you, Igor Olehov. He is a partner of the CMS, Cameron McKenna. We are very grateful for your active participation in our today's event. And there is a question: can Ukraine opt out of the immigration policy of the EU would not permit immigrants from third countries to move to Ukraine for 50 years? I think we covered it a bit, but Nicoleta, may you comment on this particular example?
I can sense, I mean, Oleksii hinted that Igor is perhaps more than just an acquaintance and perhaps their friend, because I clearly see there's a lot of sense, a lot of humor also in these very provocative questions. Maybe, revise the period of 50 years and then you might, get closer to a compromise. If you put 50 years on the table, you might be ending up alone at the table very fast.
But then 5 years with opportunity to prolong.
Well, it depends, right? You need to justify such a request. Even if it's 1 year, you need to justify it. What risk? I mean, if you speak about third country immigrants, yeah, there is a quota system of allocation of refugees in the process of applying for asylum. And in principle, and I say in principle, every member state should carry their weight, which doesn't happen. So it's also very difficult probably from the union to expect something from a future member state that it doesn't manage to impose on its current members, right? To have some discipline there. And you end up with situations where only a couple of member states really carry most of the burden in that sense. So if you can justify it beyond discriminatory grounds, which stand no chance, right? If there's an interest, a real interest, or a real risk in this request, I'm sure it will be considered. Why not? I mean, it all depends on what arguments you have to justify the request that you have. And even a request that may seem very absurd now, me not being familiar with the details or behind such a question, in practice, it would be actually something very rational and very common sense.
Nice. Thank you. Then next question is, what sectors of Ukraine economy are attractive potentially for EU market? Question is to Oleksii, but
Yeah, I just wanted also to add, like if we take this completely out of context, of context of Ukraine, of the war, politicians in member states will need to explain to their voters why Ukraine got an opt-out of the immigration policy of the EU, and they didn't. And it's on face value, out of context, right? Without, because Nicoleta is right that 10 years from now, there can be very good arguments for it. Overall, you can see there's a lot of voters in member states that feel very strongly about immigration policy, and they're very unlikely to give a free pass to their politicians on something like this, and therefore their politicians would be inclined to, on face value, to not to agree to such an exemption, unless there are very good arguments that they can then explain to their voters. So it's not only Ukrainian government and the European Commission, it's not either the European Parliament, it's also actual politicians in member states. And the question was, yes, sorry, what sectors of Ukrainian economy are attractive potentially for EU market? Well, defense, 2 days ago or something like that, President of the European Commission was opening European Defense Innovation Office here in Kyiv. There's a lot of innovation happening in defense in Ukraine, and drones, in radio warfare, and all kinds of areas. And of course, that's like a sector that's going to be very interesting for EU market as well. Agri-food, critical raw materials, ICT, industry, all the usual stuff where we have the talents, right? The human capital, the history, the relevant raw materials, and the relevant industry right now. Also nearshoring, strategic autonomy, supply chains, all of the areas in which EU is investing to be more independent and less reliant on other countries would be areas that Ukraine can take advantage of in terms of internal economic development to solve or to address, to better address those areas.
I agree with Oleksii. I think also in respect to the crisis with electronical components on the not only EU market but worldwide, I think Ukraine can be quite an interesting market in terms of its history and its industry history. And I think it can really bring a new modern stage of Ukrainian economy in that areas as well. It's quite broad list, because sometimes people say, oh, it's agriculture and IT. It's much more, I would say. Nicoleta, what do you think?
Well, without obviously having the knowledge of Oleksii, I also know Ukraine for its young, very qualified workforce. So, you know, experts in a variety of fields. I have personally acquaintances who have had like large numbers of programmers based in Ukraine. And of course, I agree, defense, but also, as Oleksii said, geopolitical location of the country. So I think the implications of that concept are wider. So it has many advantages or many things that it would bring in the EU, and why Ukraine is interesting for the EU to have as a member state.
I see. Thank you. And I think we shall start wrapping up the event because we are talking for 1 hour and a half, and the discussion is so vivid and interesting that I think we all lost the count of time. But before we do that, Oleksii, may I ask you to tell us about Better Regulation Delivery Office and what you are actually doing, and what opportunities maybe our participants or those who will listen us in recording may have in your.
Yeah, so if you're a Ukrainian lawyer or a lawyer that wants to work on these issues, feel free to apply to our jobs. We're growing. We need more people that would be working on euro integration and policy issues, and would be very happy to for your listeners to join, and for stakeholders outside Ukraine in the EU. If you need anything from a Ukrainian nonprofit that works on better regulation, euro integration, and other issues, feel free to reach out. We're still growing our network in Brussels and in member states, and if you're around or if we're around, we'll be happy to drink a cup of coffee and discuss how we can coordinate and work together.
Thank you, Oleksii. Then I think we shall start closing the event. I would like to say thank you to Nicoleta and to Oleksii. Thank you for finding time and for finding opportunity to speak at the International Law Committee event. I hope to see you in future as well. And of course, to Anna Bukvych, my co-moderator, because I think Anna brought more than 200% for this event to make it happen. And I will give the floor to Anna because I got sick and I think I am completely losing my voice.
Yeah, maybe just continue the words mentioned by Oleksii, that I think that we should work together very closely and use all the opportunities to push Ukraine to become EU member, because it's really important in the condition we have now. It was important from the beginning of our independence, and unfortunately, a lot of factors which can have impact on our way. I think that we are now progressing a lot, and for all of us, it is a good opportunity to help as much as we have, and to make this progress possible. And I have a very my favorite quote, that Ukraine is not going to Ukraine. Ukraine is not going to Europe. Ukraine is coming back to Europe. That's why I think it's very important for us to realize and understand that we should do everything to come back to Europe again. And for sure, thank you very much for all your contribution and participation. I think that we have a very good, productive meeting, and indeed we will have the numbers of webinars and seminars and other events, maybe sometimes offline, to see each other. But in the perspective, we have another one related to investments and all other processes related to investment in Ukraine. So you are very welcome. And if you have any ideas, we are open to cooperation and we'll be happy to see you and to meet you. So thank you very much once again. It was nice to meet you here.
If I may, use 1 minute, say what I have heard also in your questions and in the questions raised by the participants. There is some degree of apprehension, because the whole system of the country will be reshuffled, and there will be a significant change, both in terms of administration and the laws, the type of laws that you will have, but also in terms of travel opportunities, industries that will come, competition that you will be exposed to investors. One point, and there will be many disputes with investors because, you know, some trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements that you now have in place will no longer be valid, and then the investors will sue. So it's going to be crazy, but don't be afraid of this craziness, because in this craziness there's a lot of opportunity for everyone. And I also sense the second thing that I sensed was impatience with what was done already and how fast things are being done. Again, I take your time. I mean, you are on your own track. You don't need to compare yourself with any other. You just go on your own track, hold on to your values, but be open to others, and you'll get there. Just be, you know, keep on going. That's my advice.
Thank you very much. It's really important to understand that each country has its own path, and we just need to take the advantages, because it is also a very good quote that Europe, it's not just words, it's the rules and the system. So we need to have these rules and the system, and for sure it's not that easy process. Yeah, so thank you very much for this advices. It was really interesting to hear you all, and yeah, hope to see you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.